Before we jump in, a quick note of who's behind this podcast. Imagine this. You're about to close this massive deal. You've been grinding for it. You're pumped. And then your customer's legal team decides to make things interesting. What happens if you get hacked? How do you protect your data? And then your brain just goes blank. That's the nightmare founders deal with all the time. That's actually what YSecurity solves, the sponsor of today's show. There are 40 plus security engineers who've actually done security at Apple, Uber, Microsoft, Robinhood, Brex, and so many more. And get this, you don't hire them, you rent them by the hour. No massive salaries, no expensive consultants, just real experts embedded in your company, helping you get SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, whatever it is that you need to close that big deal. Set a monthly cap, know exactly what you're spending, and close the deal. Head to ysecurity.io/startups and book your free strategy call. Your first 8 hours are free. 40 engineers, 1 full working day, totally free. Go take it. ysecurity.io/startups. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Security Podcast of Silicon Valley. I'm your host, John McLaughlin, and I'm joined today with the other host, Sasha Sinkovich, and we have an amazing guest to share with everyone today, the co-founder and CEO of Oso, Graham Neray. Welcome to the show, Graham.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Before the show started, we were actually chatting a little bit about our experiences. Graham, what brought you into the security and compliance space? And what are you most excited about?
Like every young American boy, I grew up dreaming of roles and permissions. No, I'm just kidding. So
hey, is that too far from the truth? Maybe sometimes,
What happened is that when I left my last company to start Oso, we were actually working on something else, but I remember having a number of meetings in a relatively short period of time where prospective customers were talking to us about the challenges that they had with permissions, which I thought was kind of nuts because this is not like a new problem. It's a problem as old as computers. But at any rate, I thought that was kind of crazy, but we went to go spend a little more time on it. And it turns out it's like a huge problem for people. And we just started pulling on that thread and here we are.
Yeah. So for all of our listeners, Oso is authorization as a service.
Yes. You got it. Yeah. So Oso, you can think about Oso. Oso is like a invisible permissions layer powering the permissions in products that you know and use, like Brex, Inventa, ZoomInfo, Product Board, Webflow. And so every time you log into one of these products, everything that you do and everything that's being put on the page is being authorized against Oso in real time. And so traditionally, everyone has built this sort of thing from scratch. They start with something simple. It gets more complicated over a period of time, band-aid, whatever. And then everyone does a big refactor. This is sort of the pattern that we saw play out over and over again. Now, if you think about this in the context of what's happening in software more generally, AWS, Twilio, companies like this over the last 15 or 20 years have normalized the idea that if the thing isn't making your beer taste better, you should consider buying it instead of building it. And so for us, we see permissions as being sort of one of the last layers to fall in this whole as a service thing that's been going on for the last 15 or 20 years.
You mentioned it's not a new problem, but how come that in 10, 15 years that the problem has existed? I would argue that it existed for much longer. No one was able to solve it in a way such that any company can take it as an off-the-shelf solution and just implement it without and having to apply patches on top of it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I wish I truly understood the answer. I mean, investors ask me that all the time. It's basically why now? And I can give you some hypotheses, but the truth is I don't know. There are definitely some things that make it especially hard. What makes it especially hard is that you check permissions at various levels in the stacks. You check permissions at the front end and, back-end handlers at the database level. And so already you're sort of starting from a place of fragmentation. That's one challenge. Another challenge is there's certain kinds of architectures that have sprouted up over the last 10 years that make this problem a lot more challenging. So for instance, if you have a monolithic application, all the data you'd need to answer an authorization question is always right there in your database. But all the companies that moved to microservices over the last 10 years or so, they now are in a situation where you might need to make an authorization request over here based on data that's over there. Turns out that's a pretty hard problem to solve at scale. So these are some of the core problems that we've been solving for our customers at Oso, but I will admit it does seem kind of silly in some respects that we're only getting to this now.
A little bit. I mean, I guess folks in previous roles, and I've bumped into this problem as a security engineer in my past lives I've had out here in Silicon Valley. And I remember building a lot of in-house stuff, like big long if then else
Yeah.
checks, you know,
Yes.
and
Yes.
you do kind of what you have to do kind of sometimes. And do you find that you replace when you land a new deal or a new partner, are you replacing like some janky in-house built system like what
Always.
I used to build?
It's just about always replacing some sort of homegrown solution. Security teams love Oso because usually it's like the platform team or, you know, a product team that's building permissions. Finally, with something like Oso, the security team gets some amount of like control and visibility and ability to sleep at night.
Are you guys combining auth N and auth Z under
No.
same
So
layer,
this
or
is just,
you keep them separate?
it's a good question. Customers of Oso, partners of Oso, people have said, oh, why don't you build an authentication product? And I think there's a world in which we could. You know, there's good evidence. That's like a whole other company. And so we're still relatively small in the grand scheme of things. And so in order to stay, you know, in the future, sure, maybe the very, very long-term future, but for now, we're like squarely focused on permissions. And by the way, permissions are still fundamentally broken out in the world. We tolerate a lot of over permissioning in all the apps that we use because there's like a finite limit on the amount of time that you or I have to do like bad or stupid things. But AI doesn't have that constraint. And so the sort of the way that we've allowed everyone in an application to accrue standing privileges over time, that's kind of worked for humans, but it's actually not going to work in the world of AI, which is one of the reasons that we're so excited about this whole space over the next, 10 years.
We all have seen in our careers that you make things over provisioned often because it's the easiest way to get as quickly as possible to the production. And then
Yes.
it sort of becomes a legacy permission set, and everyone is afraid of changing things because there's so many workloads that are dependent on that issued overprivileged role
Yes.
or whatever that might be. How do you guys change that mindset? How do you approach? Because often things have to be made easy for engineers to implement for it to be
Yes.
implemented properly.
Yeah. So I think you like hit the nail on the head, which is that people over permission users and accounts because it's the way to make those users productive. And traditionally, the way that our industry has gone about building permission systems is in the context of roles, which are just groupings of permissions. And so people will bucket lots of permissions into one group called an admin and just give someone the admin role as a way to be sure that they'll be able to get their job done. And again, like I said, for humans, that's actually kind of, it's not great. We know that that's not good. Some of the worst breaches wind up happening is like, taking advantage of someone's account. But we've basically created roles as a convenience mechanism for assigning permissions to people so that they can do their jobs. But that convenience mechanism is way too broad, as I said, for agents. So like today, the way most permission systems, the way they work is they're like, if statements and lookups to a user table in the database, like you were saying before. Think about Oso as a permissions engine that allows you to describe a set of rules about who should be allowed to do what, describe the data as to who's actually been assigned what roles. And then at runtime, we can make these decisions for you. Yes, this person's allowed to do this thing on this resource, yes or no. Okay, that is great and providing a ton of value to our customers. I'm very excited about it. What I think is even more exciting for the security community is automating least privilege. So imagine a world where we can look at the permissions that you've assigned to a user, the permissions that they've actually exercised over a rolling 30-day period. And if you're not thinking about things in the concept of roles, you're just like specifically the permissions anyone's using, and it's a machine doing it, not a human, you can like automatically scope their permissions down to the permissions they're actually using. So that's like
something about least privilege.
Yes, exactly. And now imagine extending that to agents. You can't use the same methodology to extend that to agents, but fundamentally, the world that we're headed towards is one in which you can dynamically scope down the privileges of an agent for any given task based on the fewest privileges required to achieve that task. That's like the holy grail. That's where Oso is headed. That's the thing I'm most excited about.
I feel the energy and the excitement, and I'm so grateful that there are smart people solving this hard problem. I mean, help us understand a little bit. It kind of makes sense if you just kind of like watch a human and they do a whole bunch of things and they're doing their job and they use a whole bunch of the permissions that they have exposure to, but not all of them. You cut the extra. Why doesn't that work? Like, what's the hint to why that's a new problem or a difficult problem with agents? Because they do different things all of the time? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, so fundamentally, agents can be told to do bad things, misunderstand instructions, and find weird ways to achieve their goals that may not be what you actually said. So like, there's this example of Jason Lemkin, who was live tweeting about this like vibe coding experiment he was doing a few weeks ago. He's vibe coding this experiment on Replit, day 1, day 2, day 3, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, whatever. Day 9, Replit agent goes rogue, deletes the production database, and lies about it.
There's a general problem here. How do you make sure like agent has enough to do what it needs to do to complete those tasks?
Yes.
But but no more.
Exactly. So Product Board is an example of an Oso customer. Okay. Product Board's been using Oso for 3 years. They've actually gone way farther on their agentic journey. I think I would attribute that in no small part to their adoption of Oso. But anyways, you can imagine a Product Board customer. Let's say they have agents in their platform and they say, hey, go delete all mentions of such and such a customer that churned or something like that. I can probably come up with even more potent examples, but fundamentally the idea is like, even by accident, it could do something stupid. And so you need a different way to scope down those permissions to the fewest permissions required to achieve the thing that you've asked it to do.
You said something very interesting, and that connected me back to one of the previous episodes we recorded with Eric Holden. Eric mentioned that there is a single-digit number of agents that are deployed in production. So assuming we've invested a bajillion of dollars into the AI and all of the agentic workflows, as an enterprise, I don't necessarily feel comfortable releasing all of this built-out agents into the production and enabling people to use them, because I'm not confident that the agents will do exactly what I've instructed them to do.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something very similar. And given that the problem itself is not new over-provisioning, why do you think it's the right time to solve this over-provisioning permissions? Because humans could be doing bad things with over-provisioned accounts. What makes agents different?
Well, it's because agents are not deterministic. They're probabilistic. So you can't be sure that even if you ask it to do a given thing, it's necessarily going to do the thing you asked it to do. And it could also be tricked, as we've said. So whereas I think basically there's like a fundamental unit of trust in the human, which maybe we should have. I think most security professionals would not feel good about having it in the first place, but that's kind of how it's been going. You can't bestow that same level of trust and judgment expectation to an agent. And so that's why the world of agents definitely changes things.
We've always assumed that humans have a much better alignment what's good for the company, and they will not intentionally do bad things. It sounds like agents, we cannot put the same amount of trust in the agent because by default, it could be pivoted into doing things, whether it's prompt injections, whether it's some type of other vulnerability execution against the agents. The main point here is agents are the threat surface, the attack surface on agents is a lot larger than the attack surface on the human. And plus, I think the biggest point here is agents can do a lot more damage a lot quicker. If human takes a day, agent probably might take milliseconds in order to execute the same vulnerability. Yes. I think that's where a lot of snowballing effect rolls in. Speed of execution is a lot higher with agent, hence you probably want to double down on the locking down permissions.
Yeah, totally. I don't know what you guys are seeing, but like I spent the last 6 months meeting with over 100 CTOs and CISOs to ask them about like their adoption of AI. And roughly the trend I've seen is as follows. You have some like AI native companies that are going buck wild on agents because that's their thing. It's part of their DNA. That's like a fewer than 50 companies doing that. You have like growth stage mid-market companies, all of whom ship something with AI because someone like me or on the board said that you had to. But usually it's like a toy, maybe it's like purely generative, doesn't touch customer data, or maybe isn't customer facing, or both. And then you have enterprises, all of whom are just finishing up a ton of POCs, but basically like wrapping up the procurement of their ChatGPT enterprise licenses. And I think one of the reasons, there's a lot of reasons for this, immaturity in terms of like the orchestration frameworks and stuff like that. But I think one of the big reasons is the thing that you said, Sasha, which is that people don't feel comfortable unleashing these agents, and they shouldn't.
Not without a strong authorization layer, at least.
No, of
right?
course, yes. Not without.
Of course.
Yes. Totally.
Speaking of Oso, like I'm really curious about the name, because knowing just enough Spanish to sound like a 5-year-old kid, like I know that Oso means bear in Spanish.
It does. Yes.
So is there a story behind like how it became Oso?
So I used to work at a company where the name was very often butchered and misspelled and mispronounced, and sort of a source of like annoyance for me as someone who was on the marketing team for a period of time. And so my criteria for a name were that it be easy to spell, easy to pronounce, and not mean anything offensive in multiple languages. My co-founder, by contrast, his criteria was like, hey, I just don't want us to sound like a generic security company. So it can't be like Vault Auth or something like that. And we both speak Spanish. At the time, I was reading a book on bears, and here we are.
Perfect. And you got your logo and your mascot all like down just with one go.
Yeah, totally.
And it's nice too, because if you see the name in the mirror, it's a palindrome. So it's read the same backwards and
yeah, totally.
I don't know. It has a lot of nice properties for like the engineer that is in the back of my head somewhere.
I have some ideas of some things we could talk about if you want.
Please.
And that I'd like to get your feedback on. So there's like a lot of discussion in founder circles and like product circles around like, this is going to sound kind of trite, but like, the best practices for building a product. And so like increasingly over the last 20 years, everyone's like, you should be scrappy. You should put cheap mockups in front of people. You should be iterative, stuff like that. Am I tracking?
Beginning
That
of the list.
resonates.
A
Yeah,
very
that
long list.
resonates.
Yes.
Okay. But I don't think this works for infrastructure products. And I would say I had a really painful time learning that. Like, here's how this played out. Very first meeting that I remember having with someone to run by an idea for a prior version of Oso. I came to that meeting with nothing, like no deck, no anything. And I deliberately thought, I don't want a deck because I don't want it to feel that way. I just want to talk to this person. And the person's first reaction to me was like, do you have a deck? Like, I don't totally know what you do. I was like, okay, that's interesting. So I came to like the next meeting with the next person with a deck. And they were like, okay, I see you have a deck, but like, do you have like a demo? Is there like a real product I could see? And I think for the next one, we came with like a docs page and then faked out demo and so on and so forth. And what we found is that the quality of feedback was directly correlated to how concrete the thing was that we put in front of the person on the other side. And that specifically for these technical products, the engineers and the security professionals on the other side of the table had a much higher bar for what they wanted to see to like actually weigh in on it. Here's why I think this is going on. If you're pitching a SaaS product to someone in the sales org or the marketing org or whatever, like their options are buy this thing from you, buy this thing from someone else, or do nothing. Like that's the option space. Whereas for an engineer on the other side of the table, the option space is immediately like, okay, how is this better than what I could build myself? And so in a very first conversation, you're launched into something about like the internals, how a thing works, why it's going to be better, which means you need to have much more of that stuff figured out in order to get a developer to want to spend any time with you. And I feel like no one talks about this. I feel like all the discussion on like Twitter or whatever is just like build, ship, be blah, 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 blah. And I'm that didn't work for us. And I don't think that works for infrastructure companies. So why is no one talking about this?
There's something about economical buyer and knowing who your economical buyer is. Because if you are solving a pain point, it's important to understand who that pain point is experienced by. Is it experienced by a procurement team that has no idea about infrastructure security permissions and over-permissioning? Or is it a security team and probably platform engineering team that actually has that pain point and they know they have to solve it because their customers are asking for explicit proofs that their over-provisioning does not exist in your product or your service? 100%.
Yeah.
And like when an engineer looks at something and it's a technical product and there's technical grit underneath the hood, their minds can follow that thread, right? They can think about those things and they can think about it from lots of different perspectives of like, oh yeah, I could build that, whatever. Or, I think it takes actually a great deal of experience and reverence for the problem, almost been burned by the problem maybe once or twice before in a different gig, to have the humility to say like, yeah, you know what? That's actually a really hard problem to get right. I have a lot of other things that are absolutely critical for the success of the business that I'm focused on. And I have to do those things first, not to belittle this problem, but it would be awesome if someone who has just bonded with this problem could just come in and maybe just own this little space right here that contains everything to do with this problem, like authorization, for example, or whatever technical piece that might be on the table.
And I think there is another layer which we sort of approached, and that is complexity. Even though there is a notion that if you are an engineer, if you're a security professional, you would like to see complexity, you would like to see all of those dashboards, and you want to do a lot of configurations. Is that the case? I'm not so sure. Do I want to take care of the key exchange when my browser establishes HTTP connection? No, because Taher Algamel has made a lot of amazing work in that space to ensure that my web traffic is well secure. I want the same from all of the pain points that I experience as a security engineer.
Yeah. John, you were saying something that I think totally tracks, which is that many of our buyers are people who have been burned. I would actually say our buyers are it's sort of bimodal. You basically have, people who have built these systems before and they like start their next project. They come straight to Oso and they're like, I don't want to build this again. This is like, Guy Podjarny, founder of Sneak, now founder of a company called Tessel. From the beginning, they've been using Oso. Then you have other companies that start simple, they band-aid, and they sort of come like, okay, this has been terrible. I want this to be my last permissions rewrite. And that's like the second archetype. And every now and then you get someone who's both. So this is like a fun story. About 8 years ago, Slack, they're like growing like a weed. They want to go up market. So they're launching Enterprise Grid, which is their, enterprise product. Importantly, around this time, they're building fine-grained access controls, the ability to say things like, you own this channel and I own that channel, but not vice versa. And so at the time, they wanted to build fine-grained permissions. Oso didn't exist. They go out looking in the market. There wasn't anything there. And so they spent a significant amount of money, and on the order of millions of dollars, building and maintaining a system of their own. Fast forward to today, there's a guy named Alan Lineman, who's the CTO of Webflow. And at the time, he was VP of engineering at Slack. Alan greenlit the permissions project at Slack, except now that he's the CTO at Webflow, they're in the exact same situation, growing like a weed, growing up market, want to support fine-grained permissions, except instead of building it internally this time, they're buying Oso. And I think that journey is very much encapsulates like the journey of most of our customers.
Yep. No, I totally get that. And it kind of like resonates with this one notion of you really only should give production access to engineers that do not want production access. Because there's a certain amount of respect for like, okay, this is what we're entering into. Do I really need to do all of this stuff? Like in the case of building a system, a build versus buy system, if there's an incredibly talented team that's already thought through and been burned a couple of times, maybe throughout their careers, bring all of that experience into a new product, are slugging through the works, they've got everything riding on the success of what they're bringing to market, and they're obsessed with this one problem. By buying a product from a company like that, you're welcoming all of that expertise into your team, into your space that you get a benefit from that you wouldn't normally have like otherwise. Like face it, it's hard to find security experts out there who have all of the experience to be able to execute on these things. And so it makes a lot of sense, economically speaking, just to group everyone together and like focus on that just for a little bit of time, nail it, and share with the rest of the security community. There's
big time. And I think like, so one area that comes to mind for that is like, if you wanted to look up like schema design best practices for Postgres, for whatever, some use case, like you can find blog posts from here till kingdom come on that. But if you look up like best practices for building authorization in GraphQL, like I promise you're going to find almost nothing except for some of the things that Oso's been writing over the last few years. I remember when we started working on this, even just trying to get a common language and mental model for the problem was really challenging. And so one of the things that we've done over the last 5 years is write a pretty comprehensive set of technical documentation on the domain. It's not specific to Oso. And so there's no like vendor component in this thing. It's called Authorization Academy. I totally agree. This is the kind of thing that I was really just surprised didn't exist before Oso, but is the kind of thing now that we regularly hear from security professionals in the community using with their teams, whether or not they're using Oso, which by the way, like I think that's a great thing.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say has been the absolute best day along your entrepreneurial journey? I mean, you've been with Oso for more than 5 years now, so you really focus on this problem for a good chunk of time.
Maybe the day we signed our first customer. I do remember it. It was a Friday night. They gave me like a verbal over a Zoom. It was from the CTO of that company. So I sort of felt like, okay, I'm going to take this. And I sat at my desk for like 10 minutes by myself after that in the evening, just like hanging out and absorbing it. That was pretty good. Yeah.
It's amazing. How many people did you have on the team when that happened?
Less than 10. I don't remember exactly.
Wow. Not too many. So that was a real confirmation point.
Yeah. It was like, okay, they're going to pay money to us. Great.
The first one to jump in.
Yeah. And obviously, and you can just imagine for a company like Oso, we're a critical on-path production service. If Oso is slow, your app is slow. If Oso is down, your app is down. So you can imagine it took a lot to get someone to take that bet. Once you get a few people to take the bet, then other people see that they're not the first, and it just sort of snowballs from there.
This goes back to the fact that you solve a real pain point, because if you're not solving a real pain point, there is a lot less appetite for taking the risk with the new vendor. At that time, it was a new vendor, but now you've proven yourself. And
and that person, it was that archetype I told you about, CTO who had built this thing multiple times in their career and said, I don't want to do it again this time.
Excellent. Yeah, no one wants to take a vitamin that might kill them.
That's it.
But if you have a huge pain point and there's maybe a couple side effects, okay, like let's take it.
One thing that I think is kind of interesting about the security market, the companies that care the most about security and thus should be most interested in trying new security products are also the ones that are most risk averse. And that's why they cared about security in the first place. So does that make any sense?
It makes total sense. It's almost like catch-22,
There's
Right.
very much a catch-22 dynamic to this. And so I'm curious, like, what dynamics do you guys see that make for someone to successfully snap a market out of that catch-22 dynamic?
Actually, I will respond with a question that I was going to ask you earlier.
Okay, sure.
And that question is, the security in general can be seen as an overhead. It's very interesting to understand, in case of authorization, who is your economical buyer? Who are those people that make decision that, hey, we actually have to build a system that ensures that agents or humans have the least privilege access to the crown jewels, to the core infrastructure, or to the systems that then will allow access to the data that should be permissioned. But I think the answer to that question is, what is the business driver behind that initial question? Why do we need authorization? And in general, everything in security should be driven by business. I know for sure there are large organizations, whether it's financial vertical or it could be government, could be healthcare, where there are certain requirements. In order to do business, you have to have certain systems in place. And
That's
at
right.
that point, it becomes a business requirement in order to implement certain controls. And then you have these interested parties, usually security team or infrastructure team, that have to implement a system that will not be easily broken, that will be resilient, can be relied upon, and can execute that requirement really well. And I think that's the most important question that I've seen in the industry. To sort of go back to your initial question, everything we're doing in security needs to be aligned with business requirements, with what business needs at this point in time.
Yes. So, I mean, one of the things that I think is different about our market relative to other markets in security is that most markets in security are strictly speaking about risk mitigation for the business. And so there's like, assessment of what level of risk are we willing to take in this domain of the business. Oso is different in that actually what Oso is doing is enabling a customer facing security capability, which our customers pay extra money for. And so usually the driver to adopt Oso is about a company moving up market and or increasingly adopting AI. So like you said, Sasha, maybe they want to go and serve large banks. They want to sell to the federal government. In order to sell to the federal government, or maybe in order to expand wallet share with the biggest enterprises, they need fine-grained access control over who can do what inside the system. And so this is quite different from me trying to sell you a SIM or something like that. Usually the buyer for Oso is the CTO or the VP of engineering, and there's pain coming from someone on the product and the go-to-market side saying, we need to build these things. And then the question is like, how quickly can you build it? What would that take? Do we have the expertise and stuff like that?
But that's so much easier to sell because now we're saying, hey, we need also in order to scale and grow business a lot faster versus, hey, let's spend a lot of money on a SIEM solution because it will add us this little, I don't want to belittle SIEM. SIEM is very important, but the value add from SIEM is very different than value add from a security control that enables your growth.
You're absolutely right. It makes a huge difference. We don't need to think about how do I quantify risk for this domain. It's like, no, you had a team of 6 engineers that were working on this full time. You paid them whatever, $250,000 a year. And now you have like half an engineer just maintaining the Oso implementation. Even if I said nothing to you about time to market, like ROI would be pretty compelling. And now imagine that I can tell you it also takes you a minute to add a new role instead of a week or a month or a sprint or whatever it was taking before. The very first user of Oso, our open source product, used Oso to charge more. They were selling software to defense manufacturers, and they used Oso to build features that they charged hundreds of thousands of dollars for. And so there's definitely upside to being attached to revenue. And then, of course, other challenges as well.
Yeah. I mean, it totally flips the discussion, right? If you phrase security or you position security within an organization as part of that growth engine, and you latch on to that growth, it's especially important in those enterprise space. Yeah, there's some sense in which you're like, okay, as security professionals, we're going to come up with our threat model, and then we're going to make sure that everything in the organization like meets that threat model, and we're going to stay out of the news for all of the wrong reasons, and we're protect ourselves from being hacked, and we'll know exactly what to do if there is an incident. That's all good. But like, why? I mean, yes, there's some moral obligation to protect the data that we're given as organizations, as security professionals. Like that is our job. But why is that our job? Like that enables growth. That enables other companies to trust your company because you're there. And so when you get into the specifics of like, oh, here's what we do for protecting the data. Here's our encryption story. All of those things, they tell one simple story of like, what is that threat model? And when another organization looks at us, do we meet the bar that they expect us to have? And if the answer is yes, or it's like almost yes, but just change these couple of things here, then you can do business. You enable the growth. You become part of that engine. And then when you look at the wider market, of course, like those folks that are closing deals, anyone that's closing a deal has options. There's more than one company doing almost everything out there. So if you can actually position security to be your market distinguisher, your secret weapon, you're going to get more of those deals, the bigger ones. The ones that are more sticky and them care deeply about security. And in some sense, like that's the business view that I think often gets muddied with like the technical view of like, how do we become secure?
Yeah.
Here's all of this important data. Let's secure this. But the why like is connected to like, well, we're building a successful business here. And this has to be part of that story of how are we going to close deals? How are we going to distinguish ourselves in a competitive market space?
So to that point, I would say like everyone and their brother wants to add some kind of an agent to their product, which is great. And maybe agents can do cool things. That would be great. But again, no one's going to let those agents like run wild through their API unless they have good permissions on those agents. I think maybe this is the best answer to your question, Sasha, on why now is like, well, if you want to add agents to your product, you basically have to figure this out.
That's so true. That's so true.
Yeah.
Do you think this problem of permissions will be solved at some point? And there is no such thing as perfect product. No one should ever try chase it. No one should ever try approach it because it doesn't exist. Things change on a daily basis. But the over permissioning is not a new problem. Just like we stated in the beginning of the show, do you think we'll be able to approach the 80-20?
Yeah. You'll see that from us sooner than you think.
Do you guys adopt AI? Do you have like coding assistants that help engineering?
There's really not much AI in the product, except we have built and shipped an MCP server, which you can use. And there's some pretty cool things that you can do with it. But for reasons like you would expect, we've been extremely careful in terms of the rollout of agents, both internally and for our customers.
Yeah, definitely. You know, there's something crazy that all founders share. It's this ability to look into the future and kind of see something different than maybe what most people see. And I would love to hear a little bit about, like, when you look into the future with your lens, you can look into the future maybe specifically through Oso. Like, what does success look like for you? What do you think will be the hardest challenge that we face as a security community? Or maybe how are we going to get over it? Like, what's that biggest success sort of signal that you can kind of see out there in the future?
That's a deep question. Look, I mean, speaking personally for myself, and you can probably relate to this as engineers, you're part of this kind of like arc of technological development. I remember like as a kid, my dad showing me like the first color laptop and, you know, our first modem and like these things over the years. And especially now we're at like such a crazy inflection point where that is happening 10x more than it's happened in earlier parts of my life. There's definitely a desire to want to like be a part of and contribute to that narrative. I think permissions is like very overlooked area that we happen to have gone really deep on in the last, 5 or 6 years. And so I think it would be really cool to contribute that piece of the equation to the way that the world goes about adopting AI. If we could do that, I would feel pretty good about that.
The world would be a much safer place and
No
easier
doubt.
easier to make more secure, even more so like going into the future.
No doubt. Without a doubt.
I love that you referenced your dad. Like my dad was in technology and he sort of did some of those things with me too. I'm super curious if you could go back in time and meet your younger self, would you take that opportunity? And if you would, like, would you have any advice for your younger self?
Yes. I grew up and my parents, whom I love dearly, really coached me a lot around like not burning bridges and being diplomatic. For many, many years, I was planning to become a lawyer. So much of my mentality was shaped around like not pissing people off or something.
Not rocking the boat, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. And you basically need to do the opposite as an entrepreneur. I've basically been having to like beat it out of myself for the last like 5 or 10 years to be more comfortable being controversial and saying what I really think, even if I'm afraid that people are going to not like me for it. So I would have told myself to start that process when I was like 10 instead of when I was like 30.
That's great. That's great advice. But like the things that happen to us, they shape us, and you seem like an amazing human being in some sense. If you were to go back and change it, like you might change.
Yeah.
all the gratitude in the world for sharing like that vulnerable moment with us.
I also got some great advice when I was like 19 that I've never forgotten, and I would say has totally turned out to be true, which is that no one knows what they're talking about.
Oh my God, so true.
And I remember my first job out of college, I worked in management consulting for some very big, very famous, successful companies. And I'm talking to the execs of these companies, and I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. It's just like he said. That piece of advice is one of the things that gave me confidence to start my own company.
Yeah, everyone's just human. You ask for an opinion, you might get 2 or 3, you know,
Yeah.
from the same person. Well, thank you so much for joining us for an episode of the Security Podcast of Silicon Valley.
Thank you for having me, guys.
It was an absolute pleasure. Would you like to leave our listeners with any final words of wisdom or shameless plugs?
Use Oso for permissions. No one knows what the hell they're talking about.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for your time. It's
Thank you
really,
for having
really
me,
awesome to
guys.
have you.
Thank you so much for like bonding with such a difficult problem in the security space. I'm super optimistic that because of people like you, like we're going to have a much more secure and an easier path to get to that security space as products like Oso mature and like brought to market. We can all use them and enjoy them. So check them out. And if you're so compelled, like please review, share this podcast with your friends. We'll put all of our contact links if you'd like to reach out to Graham directly. Maybe you're hiring. Maybe you'll be hiring in the near future.
We are totally hiring for like all roles. So yes, please, jobs@osohq.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into another episode. This has been a YSecurity production. And thank you again. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
One last thing before you go. Think about who you were 20 minutes ago. Maybe security's been that thing that's on your roadmap, that thing that you'll get to right after the next sprint, the thing that you'll get to after the raise or after something. But here's the truth. SOC 2 and ISO, these things are not just checkbox. They're keys. It unlocks enterprise deals. It opens up regulated industries. It's the difference between selling to a 10-person startup and closing Fortune 500s. That's where YSecurity comes in. We don't just advise, we build. SOC 2, ISO, done right the first time. 40 plus engineers from Apple, Uber, Microsoft, Robinhood, Brex. This is not guesswork for us. This is all we do. And maybe you're not the one who needs this, but you know a founder who does. The one trying to break into bigger markets, the one doing the 0 to 1 thing. Send them our way. We have an awesome referral program. We pay for introductions that turn into partnerships. So head to ysecurity.io/startups. The first 8 hours are free. 40 engineers, 1 full working day entirely on us. YSecurity has your back. See you in the next episode.